were vice president of research at Michigan State. Right now, you don't, do you have an administrative role, or you're just a
I have no
professor?
administrative role. I'm just a professor. I'm very happy
Okay.
to be professor now.
Yeah, so we'll talk about sort of like what happened there. But how was the uh, so how much did this sort of, you were vice president of research in the physics department, right? So you were helping fund physics projects, right?
No, I was vice president for research for the whole university and
Oh, so everything, like all
everything:
science, all.
medical school, veterinary medicine school, engineering college, giant nuclear accelerator lab, agricultural labs. One of the top rated, plant biology and ag schools, et cetera, et cetera. So I was overseeing all that. I was overseeing about 700 million a year in expenditures. One of the aspects to my job, and I did this job for 7 or 8 years, was that I was the most senior administrator at the university who read every tenure and promotion case for faculty members. And we're a big university. We have 50,000 students, one of the biggest universities in the US. So we had something like 150 cases a year of faculty either being promoted, say from assistant to associate professor to full professor. And I would look at the files, and the reason it's a little bit unusual for the vice president for research to be doing that, but it was because when I was hired, the president who hired me was very ambitious and wanted to advance Michigan State in terms of academic quality and research output. And so she wanted to, and this is the sort of if you like to study behavior in institutions, this is a kind of interesting test case. She wanted to put a hawk in a certain position that would force all the deans and department chairs to really emphasize academic excellence and research excellence at the university. And because they knew that some hard-ass guy who was a physicist was going to be reading all the promotion files from the business school, all the promotion files from the ed school, all the promotion files from, the ag school, and subjecting the dean to a certain amount of grilling. So we had meetings every year during promotion season. I would go into the room with, the representatives from that college, and we would go case by case. Okay, Joe Smith is meant to be promoted to full professor this year. This is his file. These are his publications. These are letters of recommendation, so letters of evaluation. So we would go through those cases, and, affirmative action is a real thing. So, there's tremendous pressure to promote people from certain ancestry groups. And the standards are not uniform. And I've even written memos to the president, alerting the president and the provost to certain cases where I said, look, if this happens, we are vulnerable to a lawsuit because person from this group is being treated much more harshly than person from this other group. And it's very clear in the files, but the recommendation from the dean is that, the less strong person in terms of their academic record is being recommended for promotion, and the stronger person is being recommended not to be promoted or not to be granted tenure. It's a very big issue, and it was my duty to warn in writing the president and the provost that I could not support this and that it opened us to certain legal action. And of course, those were very unwelcome recommendations, and to see them in writing was very unwelcome on the part of the top administrators. But that was my job, and I felt I would rather do my duty and do my job than just to succumb to what was convenient.
Yeah. But did they get annoyed? I mean, it sounds like they got annoyed with you before sort of the controversy blew up. Is
Oh,
that
well, the
right?
controversy, all these things have deep political reasons. Okay,
Yeah.
so
So
one,
why don't you tell the audience first about the controversy, then you can talk about sort of its connection to your
oh,
work.
well, so what happened in summer of 2020, right after George Floyd was died tragically, there was a student group. It was a leftist student group, the Graduate Employees Union. So a very kind of left student group started attacking me on Twitter and calling me a racist and sexist and all kinds of stuff. And honestly, somewhat comically, almost all of their allegations against me were based on blog posts I had written. And in those blog posts, I'm typically, I might write a blog post about some genetics paper that was written by some group, not my paper even. None of the things that were criticized were actually my research. They were all research done by other professors and often at top universities, not Michigan State, other great universities, but not my work. I'm just commenting on their work, saying, "Hey, I read this interesting paper about human evolution. It seems like there's some evidence now that height has been under selection for the last over the last 10,000 years in Europe, and that's why Northern Europeans are taller than Southern Europeans." And it's not my work, but it's work by very prominent researchers. But I'm just commenting on it, and they would off in their tweets they alleged that I was a racist because of those blog posts, and it's almost comical because now in the fullness of time, when people go back and look at these things, they'll realize that it's a little bit like Judge Burroughs' reasoning in the case that I just mentioned. It doesn't make any sense. Actually, it's kind of like
Did you ever meet any of these students? Did they ever call you or find you or anything like that?
no, they never approached me. One of the things they objected to was my podcast, which I did with a colleague of mine who's African American. So a guy called Corey Washington, who has a PhD both in philosophy from Stanford and in neuroscience from Columbia. And he and I are good friends, and we did this podcast together. And one of the shows they objected to that we did is we interviewed a professor at Michigan State who studied police shootings, and he's a psychologist, and he studies decision making under pressure, under stress. And he had concluded in his own studies of real police officers in simulation environments, and also his own statistical studies of the statistics of police shootings, that once you normalize to the crime rates or to the rate of high stress interactions between police and particular ancestry groups, ethnic groups, that there wasn't actually any evidence for large inflation in the rate at which, say, African Americans are shot.
Yeah.
If you
So the idea is
normalize
the
the
police shoot more blacks, but like on average per capita, but
yes,
the measure is not in the population. It's how often you're interacting with the
so that
police,
was
of course.
a statistical study that he had done in several papers, which was very prominent. Also, Roland Fryer, who's a very famous African American economist at Harvard, had also done a similar analysis with different data and come to the same conclusion. But of course, that was very against the whole BLM and George Floyd, feeling in the country at that moment. Corey and I had interviewed this professor on the podcast, and he and Corey were actually friends. I didn't really know him very well. And they attacked me over that. That was one of the reasons I was a racist, because Corey, who's African American, and myself interviewed this psychologist who is quite distinguished, and we discussed papers that were published in the top journals, like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So that was considered evidence that I was a racist. Now, you were asking whether I met with any of the people who were attacking me. They never wanted to meet with me, but Corey, actually being a kind of, in his youth, he was actually a Marxist, and he's very pro logic and discussion because he's a philosopher, and he also considers himself originally a man of the left. So he went and to meet with some of these people and try to explain to them, like, well, we're not really racist by interviewing this professor. How is that racist? I mean, this guy's an honest scientist. It's not even our work. It's not even Steve's work. Why does that make Steve a racist? But the real thing is that you have to realize is that there is a battle within our institutions of higher education. And on one side are scientists often who want to preserve meritocracy and truth, and other people who really have primarily political and ideological motivations and things they want to accomplish within the institution, which are not based on science or truth. And that is the subtext of this battle. So you basically, if you're an administrator, you get caught in these kinds of
Do you
conflicts.
see it as a battle, or do you see it more as just a route at this point? Because
I think
I see pushback on Twitter and in the media, but like within the universities, it doesn't look promising.
I think it's a route. I mean, I think it's funny because my own case was covered eventually by, many journalists. Wall Street Journal wrote many pieces on it. You can go look at it. The record's very clear. There was never any allegation during 8 years when I had over 600 people reporting up to me, and I ran a budget of $700 million. And I reviewed 150 promotion cases a year over 7 years. There was never a single allegation of sexism or racism against me for all of those activities. There were, however, allegations that had to do with a podcast and some blog posts. And I was forced to resign over that. It's just that, any reasonable person who looks at this will just say, like, this is a black eye on the on
How did
Michigan.
they like? So how did it go down? Like, how was their sort of decision process? How did they approach it? The administration
Well,
administration.
what happened was that, you get all these students protesting, and of course it was that moment right after George Floyd, right? So it
What
was
was it? The students were protesting. Well, it was just a bunch of tweets. What else did they do? Other stuff besides
tweets and
that?
a petition.
Okay,
They
and
started
that was the
circulating
extent
a
of it.
petition.
So they weren't like occupying the president's
No,
office
no, no.
over
It was just
university.
basically just a petition. And then we actually circulated a counter petition, which got something like 2,000 signatures from very prominent people like, the former dean of Harvard Medical School signed supporting me. Steve Pinker wrote a letter to the president supporting me. So, I mean, in terms of if you're a credentialist, in terms of the credentials of the people
Yeah,
on either side of
you
this
want
debate,
right.
it was very one sided. Um, However, the president is, and this was a new president, not the one who originally recruited me to Michigan State. Obviously they're subject to political forces. And ultimately the president asked me to resign. And I said, well, look, I'm here. I serve at your pleasure. I mean, the vice presidents all work for the president to help carry out, his or her vision for the campus. And so I said, if that's how you feel, you can have you can have my resignation. So, but of course, I feel it was certainly one of the worst days for truth and academic freedom at a U.S. university in a long time.
But it doesn't sound like that much pressure though. Like you said, there was like a petition, and then there was a counter petition. And your counter petition was like stronger. So like where was the pressure coming from?
It's a good question. I don't know, but you have to remember that I shouldn't say too much about this because some of these conversations are somewhat privileged. But when the George Floyd thing happened, if you were an administrator of a university or even a corporation, you could see that something was
Yeah,
happening in the country.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
so this huge wave was kind of coming, and so you just didn't want to be smushed by this wave, right? So and a lot of things happened that summer, right? A lot of things
yeah. I
happened.
remember it was a scary. I thought we were heading towards like something Maoist. I mean, I remember there was one thing where a soccer player, he lost his job because his wife tweeted something or said something or posted something, I don't know, about Black Lives Matter, and like that. That's when we were doing a lot of censoring of art at that time. I mean, it was just like weekly at cancellations, and the polling like showed like Black Lives Matter became popular. Like, oh no, this has popular support now. It's just going to last forever. 6 months later, Black Lives Matter, the polling went straight back down, and we weathered it. Thankfully, it wasn't like a
I,
permanent like Maoist thing. But
I,
I thought I was really scared actually in summer 2020. I thought it was
yeah.
going really
Well,
badly.
you were not the only one scared, and many of the people who were scared were top administrators at leading institutions of higher education. So, um, but some people are in the job because they want to advance their career. And some people are in the job because they believe in the institution and what it stands for: truth,
Yeah,
search for knowledge, freedom of expression, freedom of ideas. And there's definitely a conflict there.